The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and desperation through the dusty streets of Clearwater Creek, a small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. It was October 1887, and the harsh reality of survival in the American West had never felt more brutal than it did for 16-year-old Elena Martinez. Elena pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of Henderson's General Store, her dark eyes scanning the crowded main street with the wariness of a cornered animal. Her olive skin, inherited from her Mexican mother, had grown pale from weeks of inadequate food and sleepless nights. The simple brown dress she wore, once her Sunday best, now hung loose on her diminished frame, its fabric worn thin at the elbows and knees. 3 days had passed since her father's funeral, and already the vultures were circling, not the black-winged scavengers that picked clean the bones of cattle on the range, but men with calculating eyes and cruel smiles who saw opportunity in tragedy. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had been the town's blacksmith, respected despite the prejudice that followed Mexican families even this far north. But respect didn't pay debts, and Miguel had owed more money than Elena had ever imagined possible. The sound of approaching footsteps made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She recognized the heavy, deliberate gait of Silas Garrett, the town's most prosperous rancher and her father's primary creditor. Garrett was a man who collected on his investments, whether they were cattle, land, or human lives. His shadow fell across Elena before she could slip away, and she found herself looking up into pale blue eyes that held no warmth, only cold calculation. "Miss Martinez," Garrett said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I trust you've had time to consider our previous conversation." Elena's throat felt dry as desert sand. The previous conversation had been less of a discussion and more of a declaration. Her father's debts totaled nearly $800, a sum that might as well have been $8,000 for all the hope she had of paying it. Garrett had made his position clear. The debt would be satisfied one way or another. "I need more time," Elena whispered, hating the tremor in her voice. "Perhaps I could work at the general store or take in washing." Garrett's laugh cut through her words like a blade. "Child, you could wash clothes for 50 years and never earn what your father owed. No, I have a more practical solution, and I found a buyer willing to pay handsomely for it." The word buyer struck Elena like a physical blow. She had heard whispers of such arrangements, desperate families trading their daughters to settle debts or secure passage to better circumstances. But hearing it applied to her own situation made her knees weak with terror. "There must be another way," she pleaded, glancing around the street in hope of finding a friendly face. But the few townspeople within earshot either looked away uncomfortably or watched with the morbid fascination of spectators at a hanging. "The buyer is Thomas Hawthorne," Garrett continued, ignoring her distress. "He owns the largest ranch in 3 counties and has recently lost his wife. He's willing to pay $1,000 for a young woman to help manage his household and provide companionship." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Thomas Hawthorne was a name whispered in both fear and respect throughout the territory. A man who had built his empire through ruthless determination and was said to show no mercy to those who crossed him. She had never seen him, but the stories painted him as a giant of a man with a heart as black as the coal in his mines. "I won't do it," Elena said, her voice gaining strength from desperation. "I won't be sold like livestock." Garrett's expression hardened. "You misunderstand your position, Miss Martinez. This isn't a negotiation. Your father's debt is legally binding, and as his heir, you're responsible for it. I can either collect what's owed through this arrangement, or I can have the sheriff seize what little property remains and see you in debtor's prison. The choice is yours." The mention of debtor's prison sent a chill through Elena's spine. She had heard tales of that place, a hellhole where the poor were locked away until their debts were paid or they died trying. At least with Hawthorne, she would be alive and might eventually find a way to escape. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The arrangement is permanent," Garrett replied with cold satisfaction. "Marriage, to be precise. Hawthorne wants a wife, not a servant. You'll have all the legal protections that entails marriage. The word echoed in Elena's mind like a death knell. At 16, she had dreamed of love, of choosing her own path in life. Now that future was being stripped away by forces beyond her control. I need time to gather my things, she said, surrendering to the inevitable. You leave tomorrow morning, Garrett informed her. Hawthorne is sending his foreman to collect you. Be ready. As Garrett walked away, Eleanor felt the last of her childhood die. She was no longer a girl with dreams and possibilities ahead of her. She was a commodity, a transaction to be completed. The autumn wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing down the main street, and Elena pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a blur of numb preparation. Elena's few possessions fit easily into a single carpet bag. Her mother's rosary, a few items of clothing, and a small leather journal where she had once written her thoughts and dreams. As she packed, neighbors came by to offer hollow condolences and thinly veiled curiosity about her fate. Mrs. Pemberton, the minister's wife, arrived with a basket of food and a burden of moral certitude. Perhaps this is God's way of providing for you, dear, she said, her voice dripping with false comfort. Mr. Hawthorne is a wealthy man. You'll want for nothing. Elena wanted to scream that she would want for everything that mattered, freedom, choice, love, but she simply nodded and accepted the food. She would need her strength for whatever lay ahead. As evening fell, Elena sat on the small porch of her family's modest home, watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky blazed with shades of orange and purple, a beauty that seemed almost cruel in its indifference to her plight. Tomorrow, she would leave everything she had ever known to become the property of a man she had never met. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her melancholy. Elena looked up to see a lone rider approaching, his silhouette dark against the fading light. As he drew closer, she could make out the details of his appearance. A tall man in his 30s, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the sun and wind. He wore the practical clothing of a rancher, and his horse was a magnificent chestnut mare that moved with the grace of a thoroughbred. The rider stopped at her gate and dismounted, his movements fluid and purposeful. Elena rose from her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was this Thomas Hawthorne himself, come to inspect his purchase? Miss Martinez? The man asked, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. I'm Samuel Crawford, foreman for the Hawthorne Ranch. I've come to escort you to your new home. Elena felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that she wouldn't have to face her future husband tonight, and disappointment that her reprieve would be so brief. Crawford seemed to sense her apprehension, for his expression softened slightly. I know this isn't easy, he said, but I want you to know that Mr. Hawthorne is a fair man. He's been through his own share of hardship, and he understands what it means to lose everything. Elena wanted to ask what hardship could possibly compare to being sold into marriage, but she held her tongue. Crawford's kindness seemed genuine, and she sensed that antagonizing him would serve no purpose. Will we leave at dawn? She asked. Yes. The journey to the ranch takes most of the day, and Mr. Hawthorne is expecting us by evening. Crawford paused, studying her face in the gathering dusk. Is there anything you need to know about the ranch or your new situation? Eleanor had 1,000 questions, but she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answers. Instead, she asked the one thing that might help her prepare mentally for what was to come. What happened to his first wife? Crawford's expression grew somber. Consumption. She fought it for 2 years before it finally took her. Mr. Hawthorne, he loved her deeply. Her death changed him. The information did little to comfort Elena. A man grieving for a lost love would hardly welcome a replacement forced upon him by financial necessity. She would be a constant reminder of what he had lost, a poor substitute for the woman who had held his heart. I should let you rest, Crawford said, mounting his horse. Tomorrow will be a long day. As he rode away, Elena remained on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. The vastness of the prairie stretched endlessly before her, a metaphor for the unknown future that awaited. She thought of her parents, both gone now, and wondered if they would forgive her for the choices she was about to make. The night passed slowly, filled with restless dreams and moments of stark wakefulness. Eleanor found herself thinking about the stories she had heard of mail-order brides, women who traveled west to marry strangers in search of better lives. But those women had chosen their fate, answering advertisements with hope in their hearts. Elena was being delivered like a package, with no say in the matter. Dawn broke grey and cold, with clouds gathering on the horizon that promised rain before the day was through. Elena dressed in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that had belonged to her mother, and braided her long black hair with nervous fingers. She wanted to look respectable, to maintain some shred of dignity in this humiliating situation. Crawford arrived promptly at sunrise, leading a gentle bay mare for Elena to ride. He helped her secure her carpet bag to the saddle and offered her a hand up, his touch respectful and impersonal. As they rode through the quiet streets of Clearwater Creek, Elena caught glimpses of curtains twitching in windows, curious faces watching her departure. The journey began in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on the dirt road and the creak of leather saddles. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into rolling hills, covered with autumn grass, gone golden in the morning light. Despite her circumstances, Elena found herself moved by the beauty of the country, the way the light played across the prairie, and the sense of infinite possibility that seemed to stretch to the horizon. "You ride well," Crawford observed after they had traveled several miles. "Did your father teach you?" Elena nodded. "He said a woman in the West needed to be self-sufficient. He wanted me to be able to take care of myself." The irony of her father's words wasn't lost on her. For all his efforts to prepare her for independence, she was now being delivered into a new form of dependence. But she kept these thoughts to herself, focusing instead on the rhythm of the ride and the gradual change in the landscape. As the morning wore on, Crawford began to share details about the Hawthorne Ranch. It was a sprawling operation, he explained, with thousands of acres of grazing land, a large house built of stone and timber, and a small army of hands to manage the cattle and horses. Thomas Hawthorne had built it from nothing, arriving in the territory 15 years earlier with little more than ambition and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. "He's not what you might expect," Crawford said, glancing at Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The stories people tell about him in town, they're not entirely fair. Yes, he's tough when he needs to be, but he's also just. He pays his hands well, and he's never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself." Elena wondered if Crawford was trying to reassure her or himself. The foreman clearly respected his employer, but there was something in his tone that suggested the situation was more complicated than he was letting on. "Does he know about my circumstances?" Elena asked, the question burning in her throat. Crawford's jaw tightened. "He knows you're coming to marry him. The details of the arrangement, those are between you and him." The evasion told Elena everything she needed to know. Thomas Hawthorne was expecting a willing bride, not a debt settlement. The deception made her stomach churn with anxiety and anger. She was being delivered under false pretenses, and she could only imagine his reaction when he learned the truth. By midday, the promised rain had begun to fall, a steady drizzle that turned the road to mud and made riding miserable. Crawford produced an oilskin coat from his saddlebags and draped it over Eleanor's shoulders, but the cold seemed to seep into her bones regardless. They took shelter under a grove of cottonwoods to eat a simple lunch of bread and cheese, the silence between them growing more pronounced with each mile. The afternoon brought them into more rugged country, with rocky outcroppings and deep valleys carved by ancient streams. Elena began to see cattle bearing the Hawthorne brand, a simple H surrounded by a circle, and she knew they were approaching her new home. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. "There," Crawford said, pointing to a rise ahead of them, "just over that hill." Eleanor's heart hammered as they crested the hill and the Hawthorne Ranch spread out before them. It was larger and more impressive than she had imagined, with a main house built of local stone that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. Outbuildings dotted the property, barns, bunkhouses, corrals, all well-maintained and prosperous-looking. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Eleanor could see figures moving about their daily tasks. "It's beautiful," she admitted, despite her circumstances. Crawford smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. Thomas built it for his wife. Every stone was chosen with her in mind. The comment sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the rain. She was about to enter a house built for another woman, to take the place of someone who had been genuinely loved. The weight of expectation and inevitable disappointment settled on her shoulders like a shroud. As they approached the main house, Elena caught sight of a figure standing on the covered porch. Even from a distance, she could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and an air of quiet authority. Thomas Hawthorne, her future husband, her owner. The man on the porch stepped down to meet them, and Eleanor got her first clear look at the man who had purchased her. He was older than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that showed threads of premature grey and eyes the colour of storm clouds. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He was handsome in a rough, masculine way, but there was something in his expression that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It was pain, raw, unhealed pain that he wore like a second skin. This was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, and the knowledge was written in every line of his face. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice deep and carefully controlled. "Welcome to the Hawthorne Ranch." Elena dismounted with Crawford's help, her legs shaking from the long ride and her own nervousness. She stood before Thomas Hawthorne, acutely aware of her bedraggled appearance and the vast gulf between their circumstances. "Thank you for having me," she managed, the words sounding absurd even to her own ears. Thomas studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. She saw surprise there, and something else she couldn't identify. Had he been expecting someone different, someone older perhaps, or more willing? "You're very young," he said finally, and Elena detected a note of something like regret in his voice. "I'm 16, she replied, lifting her chin with a defiance she didn't feel. "Old enough to be married." The statement hung between them like a challenge, and Elena saw Thomas's jaw tighten. He exchanged a look with Crawford that seemed to carry an entire conversation, and Eleanor realized that her foreman's description of his employer as a fair man might be about to be put to the test. "Come inside," Thomas said after a moment. "You'll want to get out of those wet clothes and warm up. We can discuss the details of our arrangement after you've had time to settle in." Eleanor followed him into the house, her carpet bag clutched tightly in her hands. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, with high ceilings, fine furniture, and touches of feminine elegance that spoke of the woman who had once made this place a home. Elena felt like an intruder, a crude replacement for something precious that had been lost. Thomas led her to a bedroom on the second floor, its windows overlooking the rolling hills beyond the ranch. The room was beautifully appointed with a four-poster bed, an armoire, and a writing desk by the window. But it was the personal touches that made Elena's throat constrict with emotion. A silver brush and mirror set on the dressing table, a half-finished piece of embroidery in a basket by the window, a book lying open on the nightstand. "This was my wife's room," Thomas said quietly. I haven't had the heart to change it." Eleanor turned to face him, seeing the grief etched in his features. "I can't take her place." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she saw Thomas's expression harden. He stepped closer, his grey eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "No," he said finally, "you can't. But you're here now, and we need to make the best of the situation." Elena wanted to tell him that she had no choice in being here, that she was as much a victim of circumstance as he was, but something in his manner stopped her. There was a dignity in his grief, a strength that commanded respect even in her own desperate situation. "I'll leave you to rest," Thomas said, moving toward the door. "Dinner is at 7. We'll talk then." As the door closed behind him, Elena sank onto the bed, her composure finally cracking. She was alone in a dead woman's room, married to a stranger who saw her as an inadequate replacement for his lost love. The future stretched before her like an endless winter, cold and barren and filled with the promise of nothing but survival. But as she sat there in the growing dusk, Elena felt something stirring within her that she hadn't expected. It wasn't hope, exactly, but a recognition that Thomas Hawthorne was not the monster she had feared. He was a man in pain, just as she was a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Perhaps, in their shared suffering, they might find a way to build something that wasn't love, but wasn't despair either. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and Elena unpacked her few belongings with careful precision. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new revelations about the man who had bought her freedom at the cost of her choice. But tonight, she was warm and dry and safe, and for now, that would have to be enough. As the dinner hour approached, Elena prepared herself for the conversation that would determine the shape of her future. She changed into her best dress, braided her hair with careful attention, and practiced the words she would use to explain her situation. The truth would come out eventually, but she hoped that by then, Thomas Hawthorne might see her as more than just a transaction gone wrong. The sound of a dinner bell echoed through the house, and Elena knew her time of preparation was over. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped out into the hallway. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the dignity her father had taught her and the strength her mother had modeled. She was Elena Martinez, and she would not be broken by circumstances she could not control. The future was uncertain, filled with questions that had no easy answers. But as she walked down the stairs toward the dining room, Elena felt the first stirring of something she had thought lost forever. The possibility that her story might not end in tragedy after all. Chapter 2. The Weight of Truth. The dining room of the Hawthorne Ranch reflected the same careful attention to detail that Elena had noticed throughout the house. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by chairs upholstered in deep burgundy leather. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, and fine china was set for two at one end of the table, creating an intimacy that made Elena's stomach flutter with nervous energy. Thomas Hawthorne stood as she entered, his tall frame filling out a clean white shirt and dark trousers. He had taken time to wash and change after their arrival, and Elena noticed that his dark hair was still damp from his efforts. The gesture struck her as unexpectedly considerate, a sign that he viewed their dinner as an occasion worthy of respect. "Please sit," he said, moving to pull out her chair. The courtesy was automatic, ingrained, but Elena caught the slight hesitation in his movements, as if he were remembering another woman who had once sat in this same chair. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes appeared from what Elena assumed was the kitchen, carrying a steaming tureen. "This is Mrs. Chen," Thomas said. "She's been keeping house for me for the past year." Mrs. Chen smiled warmly at Elena, her expression holding none of the calculating assessment that Elena had grown accustomed to in town. "Welcome to the ranch, Miss Martinez. I hope you'll be comfortable here." Elena managed a smile in return, grateful for the woman's genuine warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Everything smells wonderful." As Mrs. Chen served the meal, roast beef with vegetables and fresh bread, Elena found herself studying Thomas covertly. He moved with the controlled grace of a man accustomed to authority, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided looking directly at her for more than a few seconds at a time. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken questions and uncomfortable truths. "Crawford tells me you ride well," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully neutral as he cut his meat with precise movements. Elena nodded, grateful for the safe topic. My father believed women should be self-sufficient. He taught me to ride, to handle a gun, to manage basic repairs around the house. Your father sounds like a practical man, Thomas observed, and Elena heard genuine respect in his voice. The mention of her father opened a door Elena wasn't sure she was ready to walk through, but she found herself speaking anyway. He came north from Mexico when he was young, looking for opportunities. He built his blacksmith business from nothing, earned the respect of the community despite the prejudices he faced. Thomas looked up from his plate, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since they had sat down. But he left you with debts. The statement wasn't accusatory, but it hit Elena like a physical blow. She set down her fork, her appetite disappearing as the reality of her situation crashed over her again. This was the moment she had been dreading, the conversation that would determine everything. Yes, she said quietly, more than I ever knew existed. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his grey eyes never leaving her face. Tell me about Silas Garrett. Elena's hands clenched in her lap. The way he said Garrett's name suggested he knew more than he was letting on, and she realized that her new husband was not a man who entered into arrangements blindly. He held most of my father's debts, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When Papa died, Garrett made it clear that I was responsible for paying them, and you couldn't. $800 might as well have been $8,000. I had no way to earn that kind of money, not in a lifetime of taking in washing or working at the general store. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the table. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. So, Garrett offered you an alternative. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not break down now, not when she needed to maintain what little dignity she had left. He said he had found a buyer, someone willing to pay $1,000 for a young woman to help manage his household and provide companionship. The euphemism hung between them like a lie, and Elena saw Thomas's jaw tighten. He pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood and walked to the window. In the gathering darkness, his reflection stared back at them, a ghost made of glass and grief. A buyer, he repeated, his voice flat, as if you were livestock to be traded. Elena felt a flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks. I had no choice. It was either this or debtor's prison, and even then, the debt would have remained. Thomas turned back to face her, and Elena was surprised to see anger in his expression, but it didn't seem to be directed at her. What else did Garrett tell you about me? The question caught her off guard. That you were recently widowed, that you owned a large ranch and needed someone to manage your household. And you believed him? Elena's temper flared. I believed I had no choice but to go along with whatever arrangements had been made. I didn't have the luxury of asking questions about your character or intentions. Thomas returned to his chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, he gripped the back of it, his knuckles white with tension. I wrote to Garrett, asking him to help me find a wife. I told him I needed someone mature, someone who understood the practical nature of frontier marriage. I offered to pay a reasonable sum to cover travel expenses and to provide for any family she might be leaving behind. Eleanor's heart sank as she began to understand the full scope of Garrett's deception. You weren't looking for a 16-year-old girl with no choice in the matter. No, Thomas said bluntly. I was looking for a woman who wanted to be here, who understood what she was getting into. Someone who could help me build something new without constantly being reminded of what I'd lost. The pain in his voice was raw and undisguised, and Elena felt her anger toward him dissolve into something more complex. They were both victims of Garrett's manipulation, both trapped in a situation neither had chosen. I'm sorry, she said softly. I know this isn't what you wanted. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and Elena saw him taking in her youth, her vulnerability, the way she held herself with forced dignity despite her circumstances. You're not what I expected, he admitted, But that doesn't mean this has to be a disaster. Elena felt a spark of hope, fragile and uncertain. What do you mean? Thomas sat down again, his movements deliberate and controlled. I mean that we're both here now, both trying to make the best of a situation that neither of us chose. The question is what we do about it. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, sensing the tension in the room. Should I clear the table, Mr. Hawthorne? Not yet, Mrs. Chen. Could you bring some coffee, please? And perhaps some of that apple pie? As Mrs. Chen bustled away, Thomas turned his attention back to Elena. I want you to understand something. I may have paid your debt, but I don't consider you my property. You're here as my wife, yes, but that doesn't mean you're a prisoner. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to leave, if you want to find another way to make your life, I won't stop you. I'll even help you get started somewhere else, with enough money to give you options. The offer hung between them like a lifeline, and Elena felt her throat constrict with emotion. After days of feeling trapped and powerless, someone was offering her a choice. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, practical considerations crowded in. Where would I go? She asked. I have no family, no connections outside of Clearwater Creek. And even if I did, people would talk. A young woman traveling alone, leaving her husband so soon after marriage. My reputation would be ruined. Thomas nodded slowly. That's true. The frontier may be more forgiving than the cities back east, but it's not forgiving enough to overlook that kind of scandal. Mrs. Chen returned with coffee and pie, her presence a welcome buffer against the intensity of their conversation. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup as if it could anchor her to something solid in a world that had become increasingly unstable. There's another option, Thomas said after Mrs. Chen had left again. We could try to make this work, not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as partners trying to build something worthwhile. Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or false hope. What would that look like? Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his words. I won't pretend that I can offer you love, not the kind that you deserve. My heart, it's still buried with my wife. But I can offer you respect, security, and the chance to build a life that's meaningful. And what would you get in return? Companionship, someone to share the burden of running this place, someone who could help me remember what it's like to have a future to look forward to instead of just a past to mourn. Elena felt tears threaten again, but this time they weren't entirely born of sorrow. There was something in Thomas's honesty, in his willingness to acknowledge the limitations of their situation, that spoke to her more deeply than false promises or romantic platitudes ever could. I don't know how to be a rancher's wife, she admitted. I don't know anything about managing a household this size or dealing with the business side of things. Mrs. Chen can teach you about running the house, Thomas said. And I can teach you about the ranch, if you're interested in learning. You wouldn't be the first woman to discover she had a talent for things she never expected. Elena thought of her father's words about self-sufficiency, about the importance of being able to take care of oneself. Perhaps learning to manage a ranch wasn't so different from learning to shoe a horse or repair a wagon wheel. It was simply a matter of applying oneself to the task. What about other expectations? She asked, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but knowing the question had to be asked. Thomas's own color deepened slightly, but he met her eyes steadily. I won't force myself on you if that's what you're worried about. When and if you're ready for that aspect of marriage, it will be your choice. The relief Elena felt was overwhelming. She'd been dreading this conversation, fearing that her new husband would see her as property to be used at his convenience. Instead, he was offering her something she had never expected, time and choice. Why? She asked. Why are you being so considerate? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. Because I know what it's like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. When I first came to this territory, I was running from something too. I didn't have a choice about leaving home, and I know how that feels. Elena wanted to ask what he had been running from, but something in his expression warned her that some secrets were still too painful to share. Instead, she focused on the present moment, on the offer he had made. "If I stayed," she said carefully, "what would people think? I mean, about our arrangement." "They would think we're married," Thomas said simply. "Which we are, legally speaking. Whatever private understanding we have doesn't need to be anyone else's business." Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. The frontier valued privacy and respected people's right to handle their own affairs without interference. As long as they presented a united front to the world, their personal arrangements could remain private. "I'd like to try," she said finally. "To make this work, I mean. But I need to know that if it doesn't, if we find that we're too different, or if you change your mind, then we'll deal with that if it happens," Thomas finished. "But I don't make promises lightly, Elena. If I give you my word that you'll be safe here, that you'll be treated with respect and given the chance to build a life for yourself, then you can count on it." The use of her name sent a small thrill through Elena. It was the first time he had addressed her as anything other than Miss Martinez, and the simple courtesy felt like a step towards something more hopeful. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than she could express, "for giving me a choice, for being honest about what this is and what it isn't." Thomas nodded, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders. "We should probably discuss the practical aspects. Tomorrow, I'll show you around the ranch, introduce you to the key people. Mrs. Chen can start teaching you about the household management, and we can figure out what interests you most." "I'd like that," Elena said, surprised to find that she meant it. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she had something to look forward to. The rest of the evening passed in more comfortable conversation. Thomas told her about the ranch's history, about the challenges of building a business in the frontier, about the seasonal rhythms that governed life on the range. Elena found herself fascinated by the complexity of the operation, by the way everything interconnected: cattle, horses, weather, markets, and the dozens of men who worked to keep it all functioning. "You said you could teach me about the business side," she said, as they finished their coffee. "Did you mean that?" Thomas looked surprised by the question. "Of course. Most ranch wives know as much about the operation as their husbands." "Why? My father always said that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from you. I'd like to learn everything I can." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a flicker of what might have been approval or even admiration. "Your father was a wise man. Yes, I'll teach you everything you want to know." As they prepared to retire for the evening, Eleanor felt a nervousness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the unknown. She was about to spend her first night in the house of a man she barely knew, in a room that had belonged to another woman, starting a life that was completely different from anything she had imagined. "Elena," Thomas said, as they reached the staircase, "I want you to know that this room arrangement, it's temporary. When you're ready, when you feel comfortable, we can discuss other sleeping arrangements. But for now, I thought you might prefer some privacy." Elena felt a rush of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. That means a lot." "Good night, then. Mrs. Chen will wake you when breakfast is ready, and we'll start your education as a rancher's wife." As Elena climbed the stairs to her room, she reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in the course of a single evening. She was still married to a stranger, still trapped by circumstances beyond her control, but now she had something she hadn't possessed since her father's death: hope. In the room that had belonged to Thomas's first wife, Elena prepared for bed with careful attention to her surroundings. She touched the silver brush, set gently, wondering about the woman who had used it. Had she been happy here? Had she loved Thomas as much as he had clearly loved her? As she settled into the unfamiliar bed, Elena made a silent promise to herself. She would not try to replace the woman who had come before her, but she would work to build something new, something that honored both their memories and their futures. She would learn everything she could about running a ranch, about managing a household, about being a partner to a man who had already known great love and great loss. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass and the promise of winter in the air. Elena woke to the sound of activity in the yard below, men calling to each other, horses whinnying, the general bustle of a working ranch coming to life. She dressed quickly in her most practical clothes and went downstairs to find Thomas already at the breakfast table, reviewing what appeared to be account books. "Good morning," he said, looking up as she entered. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Elena replied honestly. The bed had been comfortable, and exhaustion had eventually overcome her anxiety. Mrs. Chen appeared with a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with fresh coffee. "Eat up, dear. Mr. Hawthorne has a full day planned for you." As they ate, Thomas outlined the day's schedule. First, he would show her around the main buildings, the barns, the bunkhouse, the various outbuildings that kept the ranch functioning. Then they would ride out to see some of the grazing areas and water sources. In the afternoon, Mrs. Chen would begin teaching her about household management and the social obligations that came with being the wife of a prominent rancher. "It sounds overwhelming," Eleanor admitted. "It is at first," Thomas agreed, "but you'll pick it up quickly. The key is understanding that everything here is connected. The cattle need good grass and water, the horses need care and training, the men need decent food and fair treatment. It's all part of a whole." After breakfast, Thomas led her outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch yard was a hive of activity, with cowhands preparing for the day's work and horses being saddled and bridled. Elena noticed that the men who saw them together touched their hats respectfully, but she caught the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed in their wake. "They're wondering about you," Thomas said, noticing her discomfort. "It's natural. They knew Sarah, my first wife, and they're curious about what kind of woman would take her place." Eleanor felt a stab of anxiety. "What if they don't accept me?" "They will, if you show them that you're willing to work and that you care about this place. Ranch hands respect competence and fairness above all else. Show them that, and they'll follow you anywhere." The first stop on their tour was the main barn, a massive structure that housed the ranch's most valuable horses. Elena was amazed by the size and quality of the animals, and she found herself drawn to a beautiful gray mare who seemed to study her with intelligent eyes. "That's Duchess," Thomas said, noticing her interest. She was Sarah's horse. Elena felt a pang of sadness for the mare, who had lost her rider just as Elena had lost her father. She reached out slowly, letting the horse catch her scent before gently stroking her neck. "She's beautiful," Elena said softly. "She needs regular exercise, but I haven't had the heart to ride her. If you're interested, she might be a good mount for you." Elena looked at Thomas in surprise. "You'd trust me with her?" "I think Sarah would like knowing that Duchess was being cared for by someone who appreciates her." The gesture touched Elena deeply. It was a sign of trust, of acceptance, of the possibility that she might find her own place in this world that had been built around another woman's love. As they continued their tour, Elena began to understand the scope of Thomas's operation. The ranch employed nearly 30 men, from experienced cowhands to skilled craftsmen who maintained the buildings and equipment. There were hundreds of cattle scattered across thousands of acres, along with horses that were bred and trained for both ranch work and sale to other operations. "It's like a small town," Eleanor observed as they walked through the various outbuildings. "In many ways it is," Thomas agreed. "We're largely self-sufficient here. We have our own blacksmith, our own carpenter, even our own school for the children of the married hands." Elena thought of her father's blacksmith shop, small and humble compared to the operation she saw here. But the principles were the same: skilled work, honest dealing, and the satisfaction of creating something useful with one's hands. "Could I learn some of these skills?" she asked. "Not to take anyone's job, but to understand how everything works." Thomas stopped walking and turned to study her face. "You really want to learn, don't you? This isn't just politeness. Knowledge is power," Elena said, echoing her father's words. "The more I understand about how this place works, the better I can help manage it. Most women would be more interested in the social aspects, entertaining, managing the household staff, organizing church functions. Elena felt a flush of defensiveness. I'm not most women. I'm the daughter of a blacksmith who taught me that honest work has its own dignity. Something in Thomas's expression softened. No, you're not most women, and maybe that's exactly what this place needs. They spent the morning exploring the ranch, and Elena was struck by how different it felt from the small town she had left behind. There was a sense of purpose here, of people working together toward common goals. The men she met were respectful but curious, and she sensed that they were reserving judgment until they could see what kind of person she really was. After lunch, Mrs. Chen took over Elena's education, teaching her about the household accounts, the meal planning for 30 hungry men, and the various social obligations that came with being the wife of a prominent rancher. The key, Mrs. Chen explained as they went through the pantry, is organization and planning. We need to feed the hands 3 substantial meals a day, plus provide food for any guests who might arrive. That means we need to know exactly what we have on hand and what we need to order from town. Eleanor found herself fascinated by the logistics involved. It was like solving a complex puzzle, balancing nutritional needs with budget constraints and seasonal availability. She had always been good with numbers, a skill her father had encouraged, and she could see how it would apply to this new challenge. "How often do you go to town for supplies?" she asked. "Once a week, usually. Sometimes more often if we have unexpected guests or if something runs out. Mr. Hawthorne usually handles the business side, but he's been hoping to find someone who could take over some of those responsibilities." Eleanor felt a thrill of possibility. Managing the household accounts and supply runs would give her a sense of purpose, a way to contribute meaningfully to the ranch's success. The afternoon passed quickly as Mrs. Chen showed her the various systems that kept the household running smoothly. There was a root cellar for storing vegetables through the winter, a smokehouse for preserving meat, and a dairy where fresh milk and butter were processed daily. Elena was amazed by the level of self-sufficiency the ranch had achieved. "We have to be prepared for anything out here," Mrs. Chen explained. "Bad weather, supply shortages, unexpected guests. The key is always having something in reserve." As evening approached, Elena found herself looking forward to dinner with Thomas. She had dozens of questions about what she had seen and learned, and she was eager to discuss how she might fit into the ranch's operations. Thomas arrived for dinner looking tired but satisfied, his clothes bearing the dust and sweat of a day spent working with his hands. Elena was struck by the contrast between this man and the wealthy ranchers she had imagined. Men who grew soft from desk work and delegation. Thomas Hawthorne was clearly someone who led by example, who earned his men's respect through competence and hard work. "How was your first day?" he asked as they sat down to dinner. "Educational," Elena replied. "Mrs. Chen showed me how you managed to feed 30 men 3 times a day without going broke or driving yourself crazy." Thomas laughed, and Elena realized it was the first time she had heard the sound from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less burdened by grief. "Mrs. Chen is a miracle worker," he agreed. "I don't know how she does it." "Organization and planning," Elena said, repeating Mrs. Chen's words. "And always having something in reserve. The good lessons for life in general," Thomas observed. "What else did you learn?" Elena launched into an enthusiastic account of her day, describing the various systems and operations she had observed. Thomas listened with growing interest, occasionally asking questions or offering additional explanations. "You're a quick learner," he said when she had finished. "Most people take weeks to understand how all the pieces fit together." "It helps that I'm genuinely interested," Elena replied. "I can see how everything connects, how one problem in one area can affect everything else." Thomas nodded. "That's exactly right. Too many people try to manage pieces without understanding the whole. It never works." As they finished dinner, Eleanor felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced since her father's death. She was learning, growing, finding her place in this new world. It wasn't the future she had imagined for herself, but it was a future she could build with dignity and purpose. "Tomorrow," Thomas said, "we'll ride out to the far pastures. I want you to see the full scope of the operation, understand how we manage the cattle across such a large area." Elena felt a thrill of anticipation. "I'd like that. And Thomas, thank you for today, for giving me a chance to learn, for treating me like a partner instead of a burden." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're not a burden, Elena. You're bringing something to this place that's been missing, a sense of possibility, of growth. I hadn't realized how much I needed that." As they prepared to retire for the evening, Eleanor felt a cautious optimism about the future. She was beginning to understand that her marriage to Thomas Hawthorne might not be the tragedy she had feared, but rather an opportunity to build something meaningful from the ashes of their separate losses. The challenges ahead were real: learning to manage a complex operation, earning the respect of the ranch hands, finding her place in a community that had known and loved another woman. But for the first time since her father's death, Eleanor felt equal to those challenges. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new opportunities, and new tests of her determination to make this unexpected life her own. But tonight, she was content to have found her footing in a world that had seemed impossible just days before.